I recently got a request to make a video about how to write music when you're feeling uninspired or when you're feeling too tired or just not that up to composing. And for me, this subject feels very real because more often than I might want to care to admit, I feel uninspired or unmotivated or can't bring myself to compose. And this is something that can drain your motivation to compose in the first place, and it's something I'm struggling with on a regular basis. These are some of the tips I would like to share how I deal with these moments of feeling uninspired, and I hope they can be of value for you as well when you're feeling like this. The first one is to make composing something physical. Music in its essence is something physical. Not only is sound waves moving through the air, it's also, if you look at, for example, for your voice. When you're singing, you use a whole part of your body. A cello player is surrounding his or her instrument, or a percussion player using his hands and his arms. I saw a concert lately where there was a solo violin player and she was just jacked. Her arms were just pure muscle, really. And there is also, of course, a lot of music where you feel like you can't sit still, you have to move, you have to dance. And if you don't dance, at least you're either wiggling your head or patting your feet. Music is something physical. For me as a composer, I'm often bent over my keyboard in my studio or over an empty piece of paper. And when you're doing this for hours or days or sometimes even weeks on end, it can be really straining for you physically, but also mentally. And I was in this exact position when I was writing my first album. I had put out my first couple of tracks, it was going really well, but at some point I was losing my inspiration, losing my motivation. And then I decided to give my studio a major upgrade. So I bought a couple of microphones, a couple of small instruments, and around the same time my parents were starting to think about moving house. So I went to their place and I brought a carload full of small instruments, which I now all have in my studio. So there I was, back in my studio with suddenly huge amounts of instruments and the means to record them. And I started having so much fun. It was so much fun to just grab something from the shelf, start playing around with it and try to come up with something for the instrument, even though most of the times I was using the instrument in a way that it's definitely not meant to be used. And I was using these instruments both as large elements I was building my tracks around, or as small elements just to add a little bit of realism in my tracks. And abandoning the keyboard, grabbing an instrument and making music something physical again was something that got me out of this rut and got me inspired again for the remainder of the album. My second tip is to stay inspired to be inspired. I often find inspiration in the music that I love. And I know it might be very overwhelming to listen to the composers or artists that you admire, because you might feel that you're nowhere near their level yet. But this doesn't matter. We all have our own paths and we're all growing still. But most of the time I often forget this because I'm just completely immersed in how much I love this music. And this feeling of awe is something that inspires me to dive into the music of this composer or performer. Why do I love it so much? What is it that brings me back time and time again to this piece of music? An example for me in this is Jacob Collier. He is a jazz musician, composer, producer. When I listen to his music, I always feel so inspired because not only the way he creates the music and the way it sounds, which I love, but also in everything he does, you can hear the amount of joy that is put into there. And it also reminds me of how much joy I always feel when I make music. Another good way to do this might be to go back to the piece or pieces of music that got you into film music or classical music or any kind of music. For me, for example, I love the soundtrack to How to Train Your Dragon. And I still remember the first times I heard the one track of the album, which is Forbidden Friendship. And I could just listen to it for days on end. I can still recite every note from that track, but I still love it to pieces. Another example is a piece that got me into classical music from around the 20th century, which is an era of classical music I still love very much. And this piece is the Firebird by Igor Stravinsky. And we played this in the concert band I was playing in my teenage years. And when I listen to these works nowadays, I still remember how I felt the first time when I was listening to these. And therefore I also feel the joy I experienced when I was listening to these pieces when I was young and started composing because of them. Going back to this feeling and remembering why you fell in love with a certain piece and style of music might be a great way to get you inspired again when you're in the dry phase of your composition process. And following up for number 2 is number 3, and that it's not only listen to and enjoy the things that inspire you, but also analyze them and see what's going on in there. I always recommend that when you find a piece of music or a composer or a performer that you love, that you try and see what is it that I love so much about this composer. Dive into their scores or into their recordings, listen, read, and see what is it that makes this so unique and that I love it so much. Is it the chords they're using, the orchestration, the way they construct their melodies? While you are studying these things, not only do you discover why you love this composer or artist so much, but you also learn new things you can apply in your own compositions. So you're not only getting inspired, you're also working on your craft. Like I said earlier, I love classical music from around the 1900s. And I always try to learn from these pieces and these composers like Debussy, Ravel, Stravinsky, see how they orchestrate, what harmonies do they use. I have at home quite a lot of scores from this time period. And I just love grabbing a recording from somewhere, sitting down, grabbing the score and seeing how did they construct this section, or how did they orchestrate this chord, or what kind of chord is it in the first place. This way I immediately hear something that the composer has constructed and I can already analyze directly how he constructed it. And next up, when I write something, I try to incorporate a couple of these elements in my own music. Not to copy them, but to use these elements as elements from my own composition process and my own craft. The next one is easy, and that is get the hell out of your studio. Like I said earlier, sitting in your studio for days and weeks on end can be really straining for you physically. So it's so important to just go out, take a walk, grab some fresh air, grab a coffee somewhere, pet some dogs. This way you can go back to your studio fresh and ready to go. And if it didn't work, just go outside some more. And something that's related to this is number 5, and that is do something that is not related to music. Read a book, watch a movie, call your mom, play some board games, draw something, play an instrument, learn a new instrument, anything really. Sometimes it can be so refreshing to get away from the studio, not necessarily outside, but do something for a couple of hours or maybe even a couple of days before you come back. It can be really frustrating to just look at the empty page and nothing's coming out, and you just keep looking at the empty page and still nothing's coming out, and it can get really frustrating. And if you're frustrated, it can only get worse from there. Close off your project, do something else, come back later when you have had some distance from it. Number 6 is to surround yourself with like-minded people who are facing the same issues. Composing and the hours in the studio can get quite lonely, but we live in a time where it's so easy to connect with other people. So whether it's online or in your community or in the town you live, it doesn't matter where you meet them, as long as you meet some people who have the same passion as you and therefore they have the same problems as you do. Being able to talk to these people, to converse with them about the problems you're facing and that they are facing, or being able to share a piece of music when you're feeling insecure about it and hearing some feedback, and maybe being inspired as well by something they are creating and that you love and you can be inspired by, is something that can really help you get back on track, or even better, keep you on track and inspired in the first place. And if you don't have someone in your community or you don't know where to start online, I'm here. Feel free to get in touch anytime. And last but not least, number 7, don't be too hard on yourself. A creative process is something that carries in its essence a great sense of insecurity in it. We might be afraid that what we are creating is not good enough, or that we might be ridiculed for what we make. Or we let our perfectionism dictate that a piece is not good enough or is not finished yet. After all, what we create is truly a part of yourself, so every music you compose, or drawing you make, or story you write, there's a piece of yourself in there, and that's just really vulnerable. These fears and insecurities, they are unfortunately an integral part of the creative process, and they can really hold you back when you're trying to write something or you're trying to get out of this rut you're in. It is so important to not let this feeling get in the way of you composing anyway. It's okay to make something that's not perfect. It's okay to be a little afraid of the empty page that's in front of you. Believe me, I feel the same way. And it's okay that you're not John Williams or any other composer that you love. The important thing is not to let these things get the better of you. Recognizing the feelings and analyzing where they come from is the first step towards overcoming these. And if you're having these feelings, don't let them get in the way of you composing anyway. These are my 7 tips, things that I try to do when I feel uninspired. I hope they are of help for you. What do you do to stay inspired? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed it, please show and consider subscribing. And from my space to yours, as always, have a great day.